This is what social housing should be like. It should be well funded, comfortable, and sustainable for those who live in it. And despite the incredible view here on this beautiful rooftop, this isn't exactly what we think of when we talk about social housing today. We see the coverage in the news, the aging buildings, people struggling to make ends meet, and politicians arguing about who has done more or less to make life easier for people who call these places home. But coming from my background in architecture and as a former executive director of a nonprofit housing corporation, a former municipal councillor, and now the Minister of Housing, I know very well all sides of those arguments. And while it makes for interesting coverage on the nightly news, those arguments are irrelevant. And that's because what it leaves out is what's most important: the people who call social housing home, and what we can do to support the neighborhoods they have proudly made their own. And to keep people at the core of the decisions we make as governments, we have to think in the long term. We have to invest in the long term. And we have to work together over the long term to deliver for the people of Ontario. And that's why we're here today. I'm very pleased to announce that our government is making a 5-year investment into repairs and retrofits for social housing buildings across Ontario, totaling up to, contingent on carbon market proceeds, $657 million. And I'm also very pleased to announce that Toronto's share of this funding, directed to Toronto Community Housing and contingent on carbon market proceeds, will total up to $343 million over 5 years. And we'll be sharing more information about what this funding means to communities across the province in the weeks ahead. I want to take a few moments to tell you what it means here in Toronto. And as we stand here, the first repairs and retrofits made possible by this funding are already underway in social housing buildings across the city and in Toronto Community Housing. In 2016-17, we made an investment of $43 million to help address the repair backlog in social housing across the city, while working to modernize and continue the lifespan of those buildings for the years to come. And building on that initial investment, Ontario is committing 4 more years of dedicated funding for social housing repairs and retrofits funded through proceeds from Ontario's carbon market. And this will give the city, and specifically Toronto Community Housing, the ability to plan and carry out crucial upgrades to social housing infrastructure. These investments will help keep social housing units open across the city and give them the modernizing, energy-efficient features that will keep costs down and allow residents to call them home for many years to come. This is about helping to make our social housing more sustainable in the long term. And Toronto social housing residents, including those who live in Toronto Community Housing, will benefit through new energy-efficient heating, lighting retrofits, window replacements, high-efficiency building envelopes, and improved insulation. And I appreciate these improvements don't make compelling photos or TV clips, but they're crucial to ensuring the safety and comfort of residents and the long-term viability of our social housing infrastructure. And by tackling these core social housing needs, like the very expensive heating, lighting, and building exterior repairs and retrofits, our 5-year investment has a multiplier effect. It ensures the investments made by Toronto City Council and Toronto Community Housing stretch that much further. Toronto Community Housing, as a social housing provider, has done some incredibly hard but important work of looking inward to make every dollar count. And through this effort, TCHC has self-generated approximately $700 million from their own assets toward the long-term sustainability of its social housing units. This work and the appointment of the new CEO, President Kathleen Milczyn, will be important factors as the city lays out its vision for sustainable and modern Toronto community housing to better serve its residents. The City Council, and I know Councillor Bailao, has shown tremendous leadership in tackling the challenge of aging social housing units across Toronto. Through the flexible model of funding provided by the province, City Council prioritized approximately half of our initial $43 million commitment for repairs and retrofits toward TCHC buildings. And Mayor Tory, who is a very dogged advocate on these issues and has led Toronto City Council in prioritizing some of the units most in need of repair by making important capital contributions of over $200 million to TCHC. These commitments, along with the $343 million from the province, will go a long way to addressing the needs of social housing residents now and for the years to come. Today's announcement and priorities we have set as a government demonstrate our commitment to building a fair society where everyone benefits. Whether we're talking about the single parent trying to make ends meet and keep a roof over their head, the young renter who wants to be able to save a little bit of money as well as pay the rent, the middle-income family who have just bought their first home, or the senior citizen downsizing and looking for affordable, decent housing, every Ontarian deserves a fair shot at a life and a secure home in the community they love, and working together, we will make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Now I would like to invite the Mayor to the podium to give his remarks.
Well, Han and the Minister and my colleague, of course, Councillor Annabailo, who's been a tireless advocate on the housing file before my arrival as mayor and during the time that I've had a chance to be here. And I'm very pleased to be here with all of them this morning. And I will begin by saying that this housing minister is off to a great start. What we're hearing today is good news for Toronto. This is good news for Toronto. I believe this announcement represents a strong indication that this Premier, the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, this Minister, Peter Milczyn, and this Ontario government have stepped forward on housing, especially as it regards the most vulnerable residents of Toronto community housing. This is money that the city did not have before to put towards housing, and specifically towards the repair and upgrading of Toronto community housing. Specifically, these new funds will help us to upgrade the living conditions, the comfort and the well-being of the residents in social housing, and will also make a difference to some of our environmental objectives, which we've set out quite recently through the Transform TO problem. But fundamentally, it is about a basic standard of living for some of our most vulnerable citizens. And that's what it's been about since the beginning of the discussions we've been having, which actually go back even before my time. Living in a properly repaired home, having a safe place to raise your family, feeling safe in your community, feeling that your governments, plural, are showing you respect as a fellow citizen. Over the years, many different governments at all levels have let our social housing buildings end up in an unacceptable state. Unacceptable for our fellow citizens who live there, and unacceptable when it comes to the simple matter of common sense and the maintenance of public assets. The provincial government, our federal partners, City Hall, and the development and nonprofit sectors, we now have a significant foundation working together to address this challenge and to tackle this challenge together. In the short term, with respect to these hundreds of millions of new dollars, the key thing for the province is to make sure that the City of Toronto, and in particular Toronto Community Housing, have as much flexibility as possible with this money in order to both make our buildings more livable and to make sure that they are sustainable for the future. And my discussions with the Minister, my initial discussions just in the last day or so about this, are very encouraging in this important respect, in terms of the flexibility that we will have within the context of energy retrofits and other things related to making these buildings better. I look forward to continuing to work with this minister and with my MPP and the Parliamentary Secretary for Poverty Reduction, with committed MPPs like him and others, and with the province generally, to repair our Toronto community housing stock and to make life better for the tenants. I believe that if we all work together, as today's announcement indicates that we can and that we will, that in concert with the upcoming national housing strategy, we can make a real difference in the lives of tens of thousands of Torontonians who have unique housing needs. This is about fairness. This is about fairness for those who are struggling, or those who are disabled, or those who are seniors operating on very low incomes. Today, we are together acknowledging it is about our fellow citizens and not about us. as politicians or as governments, or about technicalities or about arguments about jurisdiction. It is about the people that we serve, who live in this housing that needs to be fixed. Today is about governments working together to help people. And while there is much more to be done, and much more progress to be made, including making sure that the federal government, after its statements in the recent budget, comes forward with a national housing strategy that has them, once again, as true partners at the table on housing with the province and with us, that while there is much more work to be done, this is a very positive step forward for the City of Toronto, and in particular for Toronto Community Housing and its many residents who live in its buildings. And so I say thank you to the Minister, to the Parliamentary Assistant, to the Premier and to the Government for this very positive step today in the right direction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Minister, for this wonderful announcement. On behalf of residents on Richmond, on Sullivan Street, on you name it, on Phoebe Street, I want to thank you. And I think this is going to make their day and something to look forward to in the next little while. Now we're open for questions.
Mayor,
Minister?
I know that this is a significant step forward, but as far as the total money needed that you've been asking for, how far away are we from that actual goal?
Well, I think if you add it all up in terms of responsibility that rests with all three governments, we're still some distance from being able to say we've got the entire problem addressed. But if you look at the monies that are being allocated to Toronto Community Housing today, we're talking about $300 million plus. And so that is a very significant contribution, a very big step forward in the interest of fairness for the tenants of Toronto Community Housing, and it will allow us to continue with a lot of the repair work that we have been doing. We have some monies that have been indicated that are forthcoming from the federal government, and that is they're to start, I think, not until next year at the earliest, but we're going to continue to press within the context of the National Housing Strategy, working with Ontario to make sure that those two materialize not only in significant dollar terms, but also with the flexibility we need to be able to apply those to our different housing priorities, including these repairs. But I can only say that when you're talking $300 million, that is a very significant amount of money, and I acknowledge that, and I'm grateful for that, and more so than whether I'm grateful, I believe the tenants of Toronto Community Housing will be grateful for this step forward taken today by the Government of Ontario.
You say it's contingent on carbon market proceeds. What exactly does that mean?
So the source of these funds, in accordance with our budget and our stated plan, is from the proceeds from the carbon market. The proceeds from that have to be directed to projects that reduce greenhouse gases and emissions. And certainly Toronto Community Housing and social housing across the province, as you're looking at aging buildings, insulating those buildings, replacing windows, replacing aging boilers and heating infrastructure. Those are all repairs that have to be done now, but those are also repairs that are going to reduce their carbon footprint and actually reduce their operating costs in the long run, as well as making the homes more comfortable for the residents. So the proceeds from that market flow through, and this portion of it we're spending on social housing, retrofits and repairs. And as the market continues to grow, we hope to have more funds. But we can only spend what we know we have to date, and that's what we're committed to. This year, I can tell you, the City of Toronto alone will be receiving $120 million from this fund towards their TCHC repairs and retrofits.
Well, what happens if you don't meet the target that you expect to get when it comes to the carbon tax?
To date, the auctions have been going very well. We expect that to continue as more jurisdictions align themselves with this, as we see some of the changes in approach that different governments are taking. So I'm very confident that we'll continue to have the funds available through this mechanism to be able to reinvest in communities across Ontario.
Didn't hit the target, though. That's what I'm asking. What would happen?
We know the money we have this year, which will be flowing through to communities across the province, and we're very confident in our targeting and our budgeting over the coming years. It's conservative, and so we're very confident that we'll be able to deliver on the promise to Ontarians.
Mayor Tory, you called for the province to come forward to be an equal partner with the feds. This is obviously significant money, but it's also tied to retrofits. You talked about flexibility. Is this the province becoming the full partner that you asked them to be?
I think it is a huge step forward in that direction, and I think that my discussions with the minister about, and he just made some remarks himself about what flexibility or what the definition of energy retrofits can be, and this is not